Welcome to the Deep Dive. We
Yeah.
are so glad you are here with us today because, well, think for a moment about how comforting a traditional medical diagnosis can be.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, like you trip, you break your arm, and you go to the hospital. The doctor just throws an x-ray up on a light board, points to a jagged white line, and says, well, there's the problem.
Yeah, it's definitive. Clean.
Exactly.
Oh,
Clean. But, at some point in your life, you or someone you love deeply is going to face a profound loss. And the second you step into the world of bereavement and emotional pain, that diagnostic x-ray machine just completely shatters.
it really does. You're suddenly looking at a landscape that is incredibly murky.
So murky. I mean, how do you actually know if the crushing weight you're experiencing is like a natural, necessary healing process, or if it has crossed the line into a clinical psychiatric condition that requires medical help?
And that boundary is honestly one of the most highly debated frontiers in modern medicine right now. It's not just some exercise in academic hair splitting.
Right, because for the person actually sitting in the doctor's office, it is an incredibly high-stakes distinction.
Literally, it dictates whether a suffering person gets a supportive shoulder and told to take some time, or whether they are handed a psychiatric diagnosis and a prescription pad.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to pull from decades of psychiatric diagnostic manuals, specifically the DSM, along with historical essays in these massive longitudinal studies. We want to map out the exact boundary between normal grief and clinical depression.
Yeah, because we need to understand how experts tell them apart, what happens when they get it wrong, and why our cultural expectations of grief are mostly built on a massive misunderstanding.
Which is wild to me. To start from the outside, extreme sadness just looks like extreme sadness, right?
Mm.
If someone is crying on their couch, how does a clinician know what they're actually looking at?
Well, to understand the boundary, we first have to strip away the jargon. Clinicians look past the tears and examine the actual architecture of the suffering.
The texture of the pain, essentially.
Exactly. And the first major distinction is about the constancy of it. We look at whether the pain is constant or if it fluctuates. Grief is almost universally described as an experience of waves.
Like it comes and goes based on triggers.
Yes. A grieving person might be having a totally functional, maybe even joyful moment at a family dinner, right?
Yeah.
And then a specific song plays or they notice an empty chair and boom, they are completely flattened by a wave of anguish.
But the environment of depression operates completely differently. From the clinical literature we reviewed, major depressive disorder, or MDD, is more like this pervasive flat fog.
The clinical term is anhedonia.
Right, anhedonia. And for anyone unfamiliar with that term, it isn't just feeling sad. It's the complete inability to experience or even anticipate pleasure.
So that fog doesn't just lift because you're at a nice family dinner.
No, exactly. A person with clinical depression cannot access joy even in situations that should biologically produce it. I was thinking about this, and it's almost like the ocean. Grief is like being on a tiny boat on the open water.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, like sometimes the water is calm, you're drifting.
Yeah.
But then a massive wave hits you out of nowhere, and you're just bailing water to stay afloat. But depression is more like the ocean freezing over completely.
That's spot on. You aren't getting hit by waves because everything is trapped in this heavy, suffocating ice. Nothing moves.
Right. And if the environment, the pain is different, the focus of the pain is different too. When that wave of grief hits, the person's focus is outward on the person they lost.
Which brings us to the second principle, self-esteem. A grieving widow might think, I don't know how I'm going to survive without my husband, but her fundamental sense of self-worth is usually still intact.
Whereas in depression, that pain turns inward.
It completely attacks the self. A depressed person frequently feels globally worthless or like a permanent burden. Their internal narrative becomes, I'm a failure and everyone would be better off if I were dead.
So they lose their self-esteem. Does that inward focus also explain the difference in how they connect with other people?
Oh, absolutely. If a grieving person is focused outward on a lost connection, it makes total sense that they still want to be around supportive people.
They want to look at photos, tell stories, maybe even cry together.
Yeah.
They welcome that connection.
Right, they are maintaining bonds, but someone trapped in the ice of clinical depression, they typically withdraw from everything. The idea of engaging with memories or friends feels overwhelmingly effortful and just, well, pointless.
Because their brain is starved of the neurochemicals that reward social behavior.
Exactly. And the fourth principle is the trajectory. Over time, even the most devastating grief tends to soften. The waves become less frequent. But untreated depression ignores the passage of time. It just plateaus, or it worsens.
Breaking it down like that makes them sound wildly different. But what really caught my attention in the sources is how old this clinical understanding actually is. Like, we're talking about modern diagnostic manuals,
Hmm.
but the bedrock for this was laid over a century ago by Sigmund Freud.
Yeah, Freud wrote this essay in 1915 called Mourning and Melancholia. It was published in 1917.
Right in the middle of World War I.
Exactly. So he was observing a society dealing with unprecedented mass bereavement. He had this massive, tragic sample size to study. What's fascinating here is that he drew a razor-sharp line that perfectly mirrors what we just discussed.
He noted that in mourning, which was his word for grief, the world feels poor and empty. But the mourner knows who they are. They've just lost something precious.
But in melancholia, his term for depression, the self feels poor and empty. The ego just collapses.
They take all the anger that should be aimed at the universe and aim it directly at themselves.
Right. It creates this massive loop of self-loathing. Freud summarized it perfectly. In grief, there is a hole in the world. In depression, there is a hole in the self.
A hole in the world versus a hole in the self. That's just an incredible way to frame it. But, it brings up this strange contradiction in how we actually handle grief today.
How so?
Well, if clinical science knows that grief is this naturally variable wave-like thing, why does our culture expect it to look like a neat, orderly checklist?
Ah, yes. The pop culture myth of doing it right.
Right. We have this obsession with the famous 5 stages of grief.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 1969 book on death and dying. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
It's everywhere. Movies, books, HR manuals. But the sources we pulled highlight a monumental misunderstanding about that book.
A huge one. Kubler-Ross developed those stages based on interviews with terminally ill patients who were facing their own impending deaths. She was studying anticipatory grief.
Wait, so she wasn't even interviewing bereaved people mourning the loss of someone else?
No, not at all. We basically took a map designed for someone processing a terminal cancer diagnosis, and we projected it onto every single person who has ever lost a loved one.
That is wild. We forced a framework about personal mortality onto a universal grief map.
And decades of clinical research have completely failed to find that bereaved people actually move through those stages in a linear sequence. Even Kubler-Ross cautioned later in life that it wasn't meant to be a strict checklist.
Okay, so if the 5 stages are a myth, what is the statistical norm?
For that, we look at George Bonanno, a psychologist at Columbia. He spent over 2 decades tracking bereaved people longitudinally.
Meaning he tracked the same individuals over many years.
Right, and his data found that a plurality to a majority, so around half or more, show a resilient trajectory.
Resilient meaning what exactly?
It doesn't mean they're cold or unfeeling.
Yeah.
They experience profound sadness and crying, absolutely. But they continue to function reasonably well early on. They go to work, care for their kids, and keep moving forward without a breakdown.
Wait, so if you are resilient and don't go through the 5 stages, society might tell you you're in denial, like, oh, they haven't processed it yet. But science actually says you are the statistical norm.
Exactly. Society pathologizes resilience because we expect people to completely fall apart, but fluctuating capacity to function while feeling intense sadness is just the brain's natural ability to adapt to loss.
So grief really has no fixed expiration date and doesn't follow a map.
None at all.
Which honestly caused a massive problem for the medical field. Because normal grief doesn't follow a strict map, and it could look chaotic or even identical to depression in those early weeks. Doctors were accidentally diagnosing natural grief as a mental disorder.
Yes. So psychiatry realized it needed strict rules. They had to build a massive firewall to protect normal mourners.
Where did that start?
The foundation started back in 1944. A psychiatrist named Eric Lindemann studied survivors of the Coconut Grove nightclub fire in Boston, where nearly 500 people died.
Right, he was the first to systematically describe acute grief as a recognizable syndrome.
He documented things like preoccupation with the deceased, but crucially, he noted heavy somatic distress.
Physical symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
because we often forget grief is physical.
Very physical. He documented patients having literal tightness in their throats, shortness of breath, an empty feeling in their stomach, and profound muscular weakness.
Just a full-body nervous system response to severing an attachment.
Exactly. But Lindemann noted that this distress resolved naturally through what he called grief work.
Grief work?
Yeah, the painful process of talking, crying, and readjusting to an environment where that person is missing. Because it resolved naturally, he proved this wasn't a psychiatric disease.
And that distinction eventually became formal policy. Starting in 1980 with the DSM-3, psychiatry built its firewall.
The bereavement exclusion.
Right. For decades, The manual explicitly instructed doctors not to diagnose major depressive disorder in someone whose symptoms appeared within 2 months of a loved one's death.
Unless there were unusually severe symptoms like psychosis. But otherwise, the rule was hands-off for 2 months.
Even if they ticked every single box for clinical depression on the checklist. But here's where it gets really interesting to me. Why 2 months? Why put an arbitrary 60-day expiration date on human suffering?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the authors of the DSM were terrified of medicalizing a normal human experience. They knew grief and depression shared a massive overlap in symptoms, like insomnia and appetite loss.
So they just needed a temporal boundary, a literal line in the sand.
Exactly. To protect normal mourners from being handed pills when what they really needed was time and community. The 2-month mark was just a compromise.
But that firewall held for over 30 years, until 2013.
Oh, yes. The DSM-5.
Yeah, when the DSM-5 was published, it dramatically demolished the firewall. They wiped the bereavement exclusion out entirely.
It remains one of the most bitterly fought changes in modern psychiatric history. Under the new rules, a doctor can diagnose a grieving person with major depressive disorder just 2 weeks after a death.
2 weeks, 14 days after burying someone, you can officially be labeled clinically depressed. The critics in our source material went totally scorched earth over this.
Oh, they did. Alan Francis, who chaired the previous DSM task force, and sociologists like Jerome Wakefield, they argued this completely erodes the boundary between normal sadness and disordered depression.
They were worried about overprescription, right? Like turning healthy mourners into psychiatric patients instead of letting them do Lindemann's grief work.
Exactly. But the defenders of the change, like psychiatrist Sidney Zasuk, they pointed to empirical data. Zasuk ran overlap studies and proved that bereavement-triggered depression is clinically indistinguishable from standard depression.
It has the same severity, the same physical toll, and the same suicide risk.
Right. The defenders argued it was unscientific to withhold treatment just because the trigger was bereavement.
I mean, it makes complete sense if you use a medical analogy. If you break your leg jumping on a trampoline or you break it saving an orphan from a burning building, the context is totally different. But you still need a cast.
That's a great way to put it.
Why would we deny someone treatment for clinical depression just because their trigger was a death, when we wouldn't deny them if the trigger was a divorce?
And under the old rules, people who genuinely fell into dangerous clinical depression shortly after a loss were sometimes denied insurance coverage because they were in that 2-month protected window. But we have to balance this carefully. Antidepressants are not a first-line treatment for uncomplicated grief. That requires social support. So without the firewall, we rely entirely on the individual doctor to know the difference between the waves of grief and the fog of depression.
Right. Tearing down the firewall solved one problem, but it immediately highlighted another massive gap. What happens when someone isn't clinically depressed? They don't have that fog of anhedonia, but their grief just refuses to soften over time.
They get stuck.
Yeah, stuck in the highest intensity, those crashing waves for years.
And for a long time, the medical field had no label for that, which led to the newest addition to the DSM-5TR in 2022, prolonged grief disorder, or PGD.
The new middle ground.
Yeah.
So PGD requires intense, disabling yearning that persists for at least 12 months in adults. Though I saw the WHO's manual uses a 6-month cutoff.
Yes.
This diagnosis is heavily based on research by Catherine Shear at Columbia. She found that roughly 7 to 10% of bereaved people develop a grief response that just stalls. The brain's natural healing process freezes, and she developed a targeted therapy for this, right? Complicated grief treatment, or CGT.
She did. And the way it works actually proves how different PGD is from depression. It operates a lot like exposure therapy.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, a major component involves having the patient repeatedly recount the story of the death. By revisiting that traumatic memory in a safe environment, the brain slowly habituates to the emotional spike.
So they can finally process the reality of the loss.
Exactly. And clinical trials show that CGT actually outperforms standard depression meds for these individuals because their primary issue isn't a chemical mood deficit, it's an unresolved attachment wound.
That makes so much sense. And the real-world stakes of recognizing this are massive. Our sources highlight how, for years, military and disaster psychiatry misdiagnosed profound grief as PTSD.
Yes, doctors were treating the trauma of the battlefield, but missing the core relationship loss aspect. They were treating the wrong wound entirely.
We also saw this on a staggering scale with the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of people were bereaved in this highly compressed, isolated time frame.
Right. They couldn't perform normal funeral rituals or even be at the hospital bedsides. The pandemic caused a massive surge in delayed and complicated grief because the normal avenues of grief work were just completely blocked.
But, introducing a new psychiatric label always brings skepticism. So what does this all mean? Is prolonged grief disorder just a sneaky rebrand of depression so psychiatrists can medicate grief?
This raises an important question, but the symptom boundary really is rigorously distinct. PGD centers almost entirely on yearning, identity disruption, and severe avoidance of reminders of the
It
deceased.
doesn't require the pervasive worthlessness or total loss of pleasure that defines depression.
Exactly. In fact, a person can be diagnosed with both simultaneously if they meet both criteria, but they are treated as overlapping yet fundamentally different conditions.
We have mapped out a massive amount of territory today. Let's trace our steps back for a second. We started with Freud's foundational insight. Grief is a hole in the world, depression is a hole in the self.
Right, and then we explored the myth of the 5 stages, realizing that fluctuating resilience is actually the statistical norm.
We saw the rise and fall of the DSM firewall, and finally we examined this modern middle ground of prolonged grief disorder, which captures that 7 to 10% of people who really need specialized therapy instead of standard antidepressants.
And for you, listening to this, understanding these boundaries is deeply practical. It ensures that when someone you love is hurting, we offer time and a listening ear to those navigating the natural waves of grief.
We shouldn't judge resilience as denial.
Exactly. And crucially, it ensures we reserve medical intervention for when the suffocating ice of clinical depression or the unrelenting anchor of PGD truly sets in.
It is entirely about offering the right kind of help to the right person at the exact right time.
Hmm.
Before we go, though, there is one final thought we want you to mull over.
Yeah.
Throughout this deep dive, we've discussed grief primarily as an internal psychological experience. But culturally, humanity has always relied on mourning, the outward, culturally scripted expression of that internal grief.
Like sitting Shiva or wearing black armbands or elaborate funeral rites?
Right. So, if normal psychological grief relies on outward mourning to process those overwhelming waves, what happens to our internal healing when modern society increasingly strips away those formal mourning rituals?
That's a great point.
I mean, when a fast-paced culture expects you back at your desk responding to emails 3 days after your mother dies, does a lack of public, culturally supported mourning force normal grief to fester and become prolonged? We started today talking about how the diagnostic X-ray machine is broken when it comes to emotional pain. But maybe the machine itself isn't the only thing that's murky. Maybe it's the environment we're forcing people to take the picture in. Thank you for exploring this with us. Keep diving deep.